Kia ora, everyone. My name is Andrea. Very warm welcome to you all. I would like to open the webinar today with a whakatauki. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihe Maori ora. Seize the winds from the west, seize the winds from the south. Let the breeze blow over the land, let the breeze blow over the ocean. Let the red-tipped dawn come with a sharpened air, a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious day. Thank you everyone for being here. Very warm welcome to our participants, but of course also to our guests today, and also a very warm welcome to some of our contributors. I've seen that some of you are in the audience, and also one of our National Secretaries, Kerry Davis, is with us today. To start with, I would like to just say a big thank you to all our contributors and past participants and current participants who brought this series alive and made this exchange of ideas possible. So thank you very much. Without you, we couldn't have the launch of our booklet today. And the booklet is part of our Progressive Thinking series called 10 Perspectives on the Future of Public and Community Services. And I have a printout here, oops, that way, fresh off the press, which you can download from our PSA website anytime you like, and of course share with friends and colleagues if you wish to do so. We have done a couple of, or a few booklets before on tax, on housing, and the future of work, so please feel free to check them out as well if you're interested. Over the past month, we have done 14 webinars. So our launch webinar today is our 15th webinar so far. And these webinars have been attended by around 3,000 PSA members and members from the public across New Zealand. So thank you again to you all to making this series happen. The purpose of today's webinar is to, of course, launch the booklet and tell the world that it's available now online, but also to hear from our politicians on their vision of public and community services, and to give you an opportunity to engage with them and ask some questions about public and community services. Our guests will also get an opportunity to respond to some of the main ideas of the booklet. So I'm really excited to hear those ideas later on. I will just give a few, I do a quick run through how we run the webinar. Most of you will know because you have participated in the past. We'll do a quick round of introductions, and then we will invite our guests to share their vision of public and community services with us for about 5 minutes each. And then we will have a number of questions and our guests will have around about a minute each to answer those questions. And I would like to ask our guests to please stick to the suggested times, allocated times for speaking in the spirit of fairness to our other guests. Please pass on the torch if time is up, but I will give you a reminder for that. To our audience, please use the question and answer function in Zoom down there at the bottom. You can post your questions there and we will bring them into the conversation as it happens. I would just like to mention that we can't do written answers this time as we did in the past. You will all appreciate that our guests are very busy just a few days before elections, so that unfortunately is impossible this time, but we'll try to bring in questions as much as possible during the webinar. So, and of course, as always, please keep your questions brief, succinct, and respectful. And I think that is all that I have to mention here to start with. And I would like to invite one of our national secretaries, Kerry Davies, to welcome our special guests today. So thank you. Kerry.
Thanks, Andrea. Nā mai, haere mai. Welcome to this PSA event to Honourable Chris Hipkins, Honourable Dr. Nick Smith and Jan Logie MP. We really appreciate your attendance today and are looking forward to hearing your ideas, experiences and vision for community and public services. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kerry. That's great. We will now move to your introductions, and our previous guests have chosen 3 words to describe themselves or their work or their motivation to work. And you are invited to use that format to introduce yourself. Alternatively, you can just introduce yourself and tell us why you're interested in public and community services. And maybe we start with Chris and then Jen and then Nick. Just a brief introduction, maybe around about 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes each, and off we go. Chris, would you like to start?
Hello, kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou everybody. It's good to be here. I'm Chris Hipkins. I'm representing the Labour Party today. I'm not sure that I could sum myself up in 3 words. Give it a go, I guess. If I was going to do that, I would hope energetic would be one of them. Thoughtful might be one of them, because you know, I like to think things through carefully. And focused maybe might be the 3rd word. So I've had the privilege of being Minister for State Services over the last 3 years in the current government. Possibly the last Minister of State Services for New Zealand, because of course we've changed the State Sector Act. It's now called the Public Service Act. So I imagine after the next election, the minister who holds this role will have a slightly different title. I'm not entirely sure what that title will be, but it has been an enormous privilege to be able to be the Minister for State Services and oversee those reforms, putting the focus back on public service, back into our public service. Anyway, we're going to talk more about that when we get to setting out our stall, if you like. So it's just good to be with you.
Great, thank you very much. Jen, would you like to go next?
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Jan Logie aho. I'm the Green Party's spokesperson for what we're still calling state services. We'll have to catch up on that as well. And the community voluntary sector, as well as Te Tiriti, and acknowledging that all of those portfolios are quite relevant for this discussion today. To sum myself up in terms of my motivation in 3 words, I think it's connection, people, planet are the things that drive me, and I think the work of the Greens within Parliament. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I found the booklet really thought-provoking and relevant to a lot of the conversations that I've been having and the Greens have been having over the last 3 years. So thanks.
Right, thank you so much. Nick.
Oh, kia ora hui hui tātou katoa. Can I acknowledge Andrea and the Public Service Association for organising these Zoom meetings. We're a little bit over Zoomed from the COVID period, but in the campaign environment, it's actually a really efficient way in which to communicate. If there were those 3 big words that I would describe as, firstly, the importance of evidence-based, and that is that the decisions that we make, both as elected representatives and the public service that support us, is that evidence basis is at the forefront. The second thing is one of patriotism. New Zealand is truly a fantastic country, so much about both our parliamentary democracy and our public services good, and this seminar needs to be about focusing on how we get from very good to excellent, always striving to do better. And the third part for me is compassion. And that is that whether it is those that are receiving the public services or delivering, we are a country that values compassion, and that would be a third dimension in words to sum it up nice and tightly for you, Andrea.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm very impressed that you just ad hoc came up with 3 words. Other contributors had to sleep over it and think about it over the weekend. So thank you so much, that's fabulous. So let's move to the part where you're outlining your vision for public and community services. And I would like to invite you all to take about 5 minutes to describe your vision. Where do you want to take public and community services? What needs to change? Where do we want to go in New Zealand? And maybe we'll take the reverse order and we'll start with Nick, then Jen, and then Chris. 5 minutes each. I will have my stopwatch ready, and I will indicate when you have 1 last minute to talk, just so that you have a bit of a feel for the time frame. Nick, would you like to start?
Yes, well, National's vision, firstly, for our public service is that they be politically neutral. When we look at other jurisdictions that are democracies, liberal democracies like our own, we believe they are weaker when large parts of the public service become politically appointed. We have a proud tradition on that regime, and we need to make sure that that is a founding principle of our public services. Secondly, we need to hang on to those very high standards of probity that are essential for our public service. We are a country that is ranked amongst the very top, number 1 by international transparency. Nothing wrecks a country like corruption, and we must strive to maintain those very, very high standards of probity in our public service. The third, particularly important for National, is that our public service are efficient users of taxpayers' money. Every single dollar that is spent by the public service has been worked hard for by a taxpayer, and it's really important for National that public servants spent those dollars as though they had earned them themselves and their own money, with the due diligence and care that goes with it. Fourthly, it's very important that our public service is open and transparent, that there is contestable advice, and that is able to be shared with the public as we pursue the very best course of policy for our country in future. And a last part is in terms of ensuring that public service appointments are made on the basis of merit, and that we offer our public servants both the career pathways and the remuneration so that New Zealand's public service is able to provide the support that any elected government does to be able to deliver on its policies. Now, alongside the public service, you've got important roles both for private sector contractors and for the community sector. The community sector has the strength that it can often be better connected to the community, and private sector contracting can sometimes be the best form of delivery. Our view is that the test for those things that should be core and those things that should be contract out is very much about ensuring best value for money for taxpayer. We are also of the view that we need to keep restructuring of the public service that I think historically has been excessive, in the sense of there being a political problem and too often restructuring rather than other options being the option in going forward. You do need stability and you need core capability across the public service. Now, COVID-19 has tested our public service, and I would give them somewhere in the B or B+ response to the challenges of the last 8 months. There are many areas in which they have performed well, but there has also been key failings where government policies, particularly in the area of testing and border control, has been significantly distant from that which was committed, and that has resulted in huge expense and disruption for New Zealanders. The way forward has got to be in terms of ensuring that where policy is adopted, that there is more effective delivery. The last substantive point that I think we need to think about across the public service is around the question of managing risk. Every government, regardless of political persuasion, faces a wide range of natural hazard risks, for instance, earthquakes and volcanoes, risks of the sort like climate change, risks of the sort like pandemic. And we do have a view that we need to up the amount of intellectual horsepower across the public sector in how we best allocate resources and manage that risk. That is, we think if we look historically at the data, the risk of a pandemic was understated, and how we can improve the way in which our public service operates so that the allocation of resource and public sector is based on actual risk and not necessarily perception. We need to do better in that space.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nick. Jen, would you like to go next?
Kia ora koutou. So thanks for this. It's a hugely challenging to try and do this in 5 minutes when this is such a large conversation, but I'm going to try and keep it to 8 or 9 key points for the Greens. So the first one is around in 2030, we want to be able to see our Te Tiriti partnership visibly at the level of strategy, at the level of policy and implementation, and on the ground level, and that we would be partway through, we would have had a Crown response to Mātiki Mai, and being able to start to really see a pathway forward in terms of forming a solid constitutional basis for us as a country moving forward. And I think connected to that is that government is very clear, and that there's more public buy-in for the fundamentals of the purpose of government. And for the Greens, we would be hoping to see that those are around reducing inequality, ensuring the participation of everybody and inclusion of everybody in our societies, the protection and flourishing of our environment, and climate action and adaptation, because there's nothing more important for us in the world at the moment than that work, and they are all connected pieces of work. Thirdly is that, and connected to that, is that government is proactively ensuring the social and environmental determinants of health are part of our well-being work. So that is ensuring everyone has an adequate income, warm, secure, affordable homes, and that our environment is supporting us as part of the environment. And fourthly, that we are developing our services and policy responses from the ground up rather than the top down, that we are localizing, and that we are becoming whānau-centred in our human services rather than being driven by the political priorities of individual government agencies. And I think the Public Service Act will help us being able to do some of that joined up working. And then fifthly, recognising the importance of expertise. That is subject expertise as well as context expertise. And really that public servants as well as people in the community are supported to stay in their jobs long enough to build up that expertise and keep the relationships going and driving forward, rather than being moved on every few years as if the expertise in relation to the environment or family violence are the same and don't matter. And then sixthly is a really strong oversight of this localization, and that being based around a Te Tiriti partnership, but also core outcomes that we're wanting to achieve, to make sure that we are learning as we go and that we are adapting when things aren't working, which is that learning system and continuous improvement, and acknowledging that for that to happen, we need to change our democratic conversation and have strong democratic institutions to support that, rather than an expectation that government will make a decision and we will always be right and have to defend it, because actually that's just not the reality or helpful for any of us in a community. And then all backing this up, and is in contrast to National's view about the drive around efficiency and value for money, which is usually framed in a very limited sense of reducing public expenditure, and not looking at the ability for the government to achieve multiple benefits, that if we don't go for the cheapest contract, actually we can ensure people in our community are being paid more, and that helps keep communities alive and flourishing, and that through partnership we can all do better. But that requires taxation reinforcing the outcomes we want to achieve, for it to be aimed at reducing inequality, providing enough to have these flourishing services, and to disincentivize the destruction of our environment and create funding to help in that transformation towards the future that we want. And in conversations I've had this election where people are talking about the well-being at the centre of everything and how we can move forward, I just need to re-emphasise that taxation is going to be essential for achieving that vision and has to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. That was on the second. Thank you very much. That's great. Chris, would you like to share your vision as well with our participants?
I will, thank you. And can I acknowledge the topic, the overall theme for these webinars, which is around futures thinking. I actually think that's something that across the public service we perhaps don't do enough of. And I think that was recognised in the consultation around the public sector reform that we've done in this term of government, that it's just necessity really. The short political cycle we have in New Zealand of 3 years does mean we tend to think in 3-year cycles rather than thinking about some of those bigger, longer term issues as well as we might. I'm sure Dr. Smith would agree with me on this, having been in government and in opposition. You actually get more time to think about the future when you're in opposition than you do when you're in government, because when you're in government, you're so busy doing things that you don't actually get time to pause and think. And actually, I think that's one of our big challenges. We built into the Public Service Act the requirement for departments to produce long-term insights briefings in the middle of a parliamentary term in order to try and stimulate some of these discussions. I think they will do two things. One is they will provide an evidence base for political parties when they're formulating their policies, thinking about the future, but also they will provide stimulus for opposition parties again to hold the government to account when it comes to thinking about longer term issues. So that will bring longer term issues to the fore a bit more, and I think that could be potentially very powerful. In terms of the principles of the public service, you'll see enshrined in the Public Service Act the principle of political neutrality. I agree with Dr. Smith. I think that's something that we must safeguard in our public service system. We've also enshrined the principle of free and frank advice. As a minister over the last 3 years, I've enjoyed getting advice that I disagree with. Actually, I think it means I make better decisions. And so I think it is really important that the public service continue to provide, and perhaps even can do more in the free and frank advice space. Merit-based appointments was a principle established by the first Public Service Act in New Zealand, and I think we must safeguard that too. Open government, we should do things in a way that is transparent, that is democratic, and that empowers people. And then finally, stewardship, and I think that comes back to my comments about longer term thinking. The values that we've enshrined in the Act, being impartial, accountable, trustworthy, respectful, responsive, again, these are things that should be embedded in the way the public service operates. So I want to pick off, there's so many topics I could pick off, I'm going to pick off 4. One is, I think, in terms of challenges ahead, one is I think we need to think about how we deliver more citizen-centric service delivery, public service delivery. We do tend to deliver our public services in silos, and the State Sector Act certainly reinforced that. I often comment, people don't wake up in the morning and think, right, I'm going to deal with all my health needs today. And then the next day they think, I'm going to deal with all my educational needs today. And then the next day they think, I'm going to deal with all my transport needs today. The reality is, people live lives where all of these things intermingle with one another. We should stop trying to deliver public services as if they're all completely unconnected. Within that, we need to think about, second one, new modes of delivery and new ways of working. COVID-19 has all forced us to do things differently. And when we're showing that there's a real appetite for that, people do want to interact with government more digitally and in different ways, and we need to lean into that. which leads to the third thing, which is I think we need the public service to be a bit more joined up in its administration. And I think areas around data and digital are really good examples of that. I think we've seen some failures in the data and digital area where small government agencies have tried to do too much themselves and haven't had the internal capability to do it well. That's where we've seen some of the worst of the privacy breaches, for example. So I think in building public service capability in those areas, we need to think about how we build them across the public service rather than each individual agency trying to do its own thing. And then the final thing with my remaining 60 seconds is I think the big shift from of the State Sector Act was to move from measuring inputs to measuring outputs. I think our big challenge now is to move the focus from outputs to outcomes. And the outcomes are much, much harder. As Minister of Health at the moment, I can tell you, you can measure the number of operations you do, you can measure the number of patient appointments that you have, but outcomes are much, much harder. And I think we really need to focus on outcomes. I'd far rather we were doing far fewer procedures in our hospitals because people were getting better primary and public health, so they weren't ending up in having to interact that much with the health system in the first place. But that's obviously a bigger challenge. So I think that real focus on outcomes rather than outputs, that's the next big challenge for us.
Fantastic, thank you very much. We will go into questions now. We already have 3 questions from the audience, so please continue to post your question. One question that I would like to ask you first up is, how do you ensure that the knowledge and experience of people working in the public and community services is actually used to improve those services? And I would like to start with Jen this time, then Chris, and then Nick. And you have 1 minute each to answer. Jen.
Great, and a great question. And one of the things that was a subline under my list is the importance of, I think we need multiple initiatives, but there's some great models in terms of workplace democracy for us to be able to draw in. And I do think that there needs to be, or there'd be huge value in having a, restoring a centre within government to help drive this work. And as one of the examples of that is, I think there was an experiment in one of the courts in West Auckland and looking at trying to shorten the waiting time for people in the cells before they went into court. And by involving the staff on the ground there, rather than thinking of it as a policy issue that was done centrally in Wellington, they managed to reduce the waiting time in cells from like over 2.5 hours, I think, I may have that number wrong, down to like 17 minutes. And I think we've got to actually, this is part of the fundamental transformation that we need to make, is recognizing the involvement of people leads to better results.
Right, thank you so much. Chris, your minute is starting now.
Couldn't unmute there for a minute. Look, I know Richard Wagstaff's on the call, so I'll mention the phrase high performance engagement for his benefit, because actually it works. If you get people involved in saying, how can you improve the job that you are doing, then you do actually get a better outcome. Kiwi Rail showed it works, Air New Zealand showed it works. So let's actually see how we can build those models into the way our public service operates as well. The other thing is, I think we do need to pick up, I think Jan mentioned it, I think Nick Smith might have mentioned it too. There's got to be room for specialisation within our public service. Generalisation is important, and that ability to transfer is important, but actually you do in some areas need to allow room for that depth of experience and expertise to be built up.
Great, thank you so much. Nick, your time starts now.
The key point that I'd like to make that we need to focus on is actually strengthening the depth and the experience within the public service. Certainly my experience in 14 different ministerial portfolios is the constant churn of expertise from ministry to ministry has undervalued that real block of professional expertise that actually the New Zealand Public Service has a good reputation for, but I do worry that there is an excessive amount of churn and insufficient reward for those that build up substantive technical expertise and knowledge in the core parts of our public service. The question also mentioned the community sector. I think in terms of the contracting relationships that the government has with the community sector, it does need to look to a greater degree of long-term contracts. That is, that too many of our community organisations are on 1, 2 and sometimes 3-year contracts, but for them, and whether it be the Sally Army or whether it be another expertise, long-term contracts will deliver better expertise and career continuity.
Great, thank you so much. I will now turn to some of our questions, and the first one that I would like to put to you is about complex systems and the complexity that public and community services face and deal with every day. And our participant, who also was a contributor, Thea, has mentioned a quote in her question: "In complex systems, the last thing that happened is almost never informative about what's coming next." And she's interested in your reflections on that. We'll start with Chris this time, and then Jen, and then Nick. Chris.
Look, I think that's a really appropriate question. If you think about in the context of COVID-19, should COVID-19 happen exactly the same way again in the future, we'd be much better prepared for it. But the reality is a future pandemic may well look quite different to this pandemic. And so we do have to think a little bit outside the box and be preparing and thinking about future scenarios, future challenges. So yes, I absolutely think that that's instructive. I'm not sure what the question necessarily is out of that. I do think that we need to think across a much wider range of issues about things that may or may not happen in the future. Generally speaking, governments have not been good at predicting the future. And I think we do have to have a public service that's adaptable and flexible and can respond to the challenges of the day regardless of what they are.
Great, thank you very much. We have Jen next.
Yeah, I do think this is a really good question. And
Jen, your microphone.
Sorry, thank you. And I think this is a really important question, and one that the government has been grappling with in the area of family violence and sexual violence is and the setting up of the joint venture and trying to establish partnerships with Māori and with community, and getting those fundamentals right, and making sure that despite whatever's in the news, that we are actually maintaining and sustaining our work in this area, because that's the only way we're going to end up reducing the levels of violence, is if we can maintain it despite the news cycles and political cycles. And that we also know that in wicked problems and complex problems is that you make a change here and actually you may see the impact of it over here, and it may not be immediately obvious where the link and the cause of that is, and which is why we need to bring everybody's voices in and have a far more adaptive process, and there's a lot to say about that.
Thank you so much. Nick, you're next.
Well, the problems are getting more complex for society, whether it be the challenge of COVID. If you compare it with a century ago when we dealt with the flu epidemic, the pace of which people are moving in response, the tools that we are using to deal with today's problems are an extra level of complication, and also the public's expectations of what we can achieve as a society are higher as well. So they're all three elements. What are the bits that we have to do? Firstly, we need to recognise that higher qualifications are required across the sector of the public service to be able to meet with those three additional complexities. And the other part of which I have some agreement with Chris Hipkins, and that is trying to make the public service more connected rather than that silo mentality. There are some good things in the new public sector reform. The missing part of the puzzle is in respect of connections between the state sector and the local government sector. We think there's a new reform that is required to actually be able to connect the local with the national to be able to address those complexities.
Thanks. Fantastic. Maybe one more question, given the time. We have one question here about senior level appointments, which our participant has the impression that they are often done by shoulder tapping. And that runs the risk of creating a coterie of yes men or women within the public and community services. So how can we ensure that transparency is maintained at all levels of that process? And this time I would like to have Nick maybe first, then Jen, and then Chris. Nick, would you like to start?
Certainly, and I want to be open in saying there is no absolutely magic senior public service appointment system that will guarantee any government gets them all right. But I do think we need to be cautious of the view that either magic talents outside the public sector or international, yes, some spice is sometimes required, but more often they have added risk and not worked, so that we need to better look at how we build public service capacity. Certainly my experience as a minister is that the top performing public servants have been those that have had a long-term experience with the delivery of those sorts of services, and that as we are over the public sector, we need to put greater value on those people that have come up through the ranks, have been at the grassroots as well as at the medium levels, because in my view, in that way, we will maximise the performance of the public sector.
Great, thank you very much, Nick. Jen, you're next.
Sorry, I'm not sure I've got an immediate answer to this actually. I suspect for the Greens that we would go back to some of our core principles around Te and there being external or Māori partnership on the appointment panel, and that would help disrupt any in-house public service culture and help strengthen the partnership, which I believe would also result in better outcomes for all of our communities, because somebody with the with that understanding is, I think, more likely to be able to work across all of our communities. And I think then it goes to good principles around equity and some of the work that's been done around the ensuring women that we remove discrimination from our system and making sure that that's embedded in all levels of the public service.
Right, thank you very much. Chris, you're next.
Look, at the risk of peace breaking out, I want to largely endorse what Nick Smith said. I think he's right in all of his observations on this topic, and there isn't a perfect model here. I do want to say one of the areas that I'm concerned about is Crown entity governance, and I do think that we could do a lot to strengthen our Crown entity governance. I think that some of those appointments are political appointments, and well, actually, the majority of them are political appointments. I think Crown entities have not been as well governed as they could be. And I think some of those Crown entities are actually delivering things that should be part of the core public service. So I think there's a bit of work to do around improving the overall quality of Crown entity governance, growing the talent pool of potential Crown entity governors. But when it comes to other appointments, I do largely agree with what Nick said.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to be a bit stricter on time today, so our 45 minutes are nearly up. They are up now. So I will just close the webinar by saying a huge thank you to my three guests today, Nick, Jen, and Chris. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on to the webinar and to launch our booklet together. I'll show it again. This is how it looks like. Please download it on our website if you are interested. And a huge thank you again to also all of our participants that have been on the webinar today, but also in the 14 previous webinars, to our contributors, and also to the many people around the webinar who actually have made this possible. And a particular thanks that I would like to send out is to my webinar background support, Bronte and Kirsten. Thank you very much for your help. And I would just like to close with a whakatauki again and say, no te roro, naku te roro, ka ora ai te iwi. With your basket and my basket, the people will live. So thank you very much and stay well.
Thank you.